And today I'd like to talk about segmenting trajectories, so cutting the trajectories into meaningful pieces. So the first application which motivated us to work on segmentation was this problem of geese migration. So this are two trajectories from geese. Again, they have a tagged with GPS. And what the biologist wanted to learn here about is about the stopovers that the geese make. So I mean, if you look at the track, it looks as if they're flying all the time, but everywhere where you see these markings, they actually are staying for several days close to water, resting. It's not that they really stay at one position, so it's not like a stop, but they stay in a kind of confined area. And the task here was to segment the trajectory into essentially flight subtrajectories and stopover subtrajectories. So in terms of this list that I previously showed, segmentation of questions, these questions fall into the area of segmentation. So for instance, mode of transportation, so I'm more on the human movement analysis, where I want to segment into based on whether someone was taking a bus or car or so on. And this change point analysis is also a segmentation question. And the two variants I'd like to talk about today is criteria-based segmentation and model-based segmentation. So criteria-based segmentation is a kind of very geometric perspective on the problem, where we assume that some set of criteria is given which describes certain behaviors, and then based on those criteria we're going to compute a segmentation that is as small as possible. The model-based approach, there we try to fit a movement model which has some kind of some parameter describing the movement, and then we'll try to maximize the likelihood of the fit. In this more abstract view of what algorithmic analysis tasks we have on trajectories, segmentation falls into this area of analysis on a single trajectory. So for criteria-based segmentation, I want to show you three algorithms. For a specific type of criteria, a very simple greedy strategy. Then kind of a generic dynamic programming approach, and then a modification of that dynamic programming approach for which will use range queries, which handles a kind of wide range of criteria, but still is much faster than the generic algorithm. So here's once more this motivation of geese, and here there are two behaviors, stopovers and migration flight. And the goal is to find the stopovers. And here with the data, we also had an expert description of the behavior. So we had a description of what a stopover looks like. So the description here for a stopover was simply that a goose would stay long enough in a certain area, and this certain area wouldn't be too large, which you can describe in terms of overall area or radius of movement. So here we have a setting where we have a clear, and for flight, migration flight is simply flight where continuous flight over long distances, so that also is fairly easy to describe in terms of its geometry. So you can either say that the angular deviation is low, you can also say something about distance traveled. So this is actually a simpler behavior to describe. So from an algorithmic perspective now, the setting that we have is the input is a trajectory, and it might also have not only the geometry but also additional attribute values like speed, heading, and so on. And now we have a set of criteria, and for instance we could say that within one segment, so within one part of a segmentation, I would like to have a bounded variance in speed or curvature or direction of flight or so on. And now the algorithmic goal is to partition the trajectory into sub-trajectories in such a way that the number of parts is minimized. So we want to segment into as few as possible parts while making sure that every part fulfills such a criteria. So you can also see it to some extent as kind of trying to maximize those segments, the length of the segments, while being able to fulfill the criteria. But from the global perspective, that means that you want to minimize the number of segments. So in terms of pictorial representation, this could be my trajectory, and now I want to cut it, and here maybe the criterion was heading, so direction of movement. So we would now want to make sure that on any of these segments, as you see, it more or less moves in the same direction. Here just a couple of examples how this could look like. So let's assume this is a trajectory and the sampling is actually uniform over time. So if you look at this trajectory, you can read off also how fast the object moved. So here it moved slow, and here faster, here very fast, and then again slow. And the possible criterion now could be to say, okay, I want to cut into parts such that within each part the speed shouldn't differ by more than a factor of 2. And then you can look at this and try to count how often you might need to cut. So here the speed is more or less always the same. At some point here, this is maybe this one is twice. Yeah, this one looks more than twice as long as this one. So this one cannot be in the same segment as this one. So you might want to cut somewhere here, and we certainly need to cut somewhere over here. So a valid segmentation, and here also minimal segmentation, would be to cut here, and then we get 3 parts. If we would now want to segment the same trajectory by direction of motion, and let's say it should differ by at most 90 degrees, then again let's have a look. So here we're moving essentially in this direction. At some point here that we start turning, so this might still be within 90 degrees, but at the latest here, this one cannot be in the same part as the part here. So we will definitely need to cut somewhere here, and then we turn around again. So we will need to cut again, and I guess over here once more. Actually twice more. So then if we take a segment here, a segment here, a segment here, and this as last segment, then that would give us a valid segmentation, and in this case again a minimal segmentation in terms of direction of movement. But we can also make more complicated criteria. We can also combine these criteria. So for instance here I could now ask maybe on every segment I want to have my speed constraint but also a heading constraint, and in this case I would get a segmentation like this. So those are valid segmentations, in this case also minimal segmentations. And if you look at the criteria which I discussed so far, or in my examples, then they all have something in common, and that is that if a criterion, so if for instance on this part, so this is this part on the trajectory, my criterion of speed, so that the speed is at most a factor of 2 apart, if it is valid on this part of the trajectory, then it will also be valid on any smaller part. And we call this decreasing monotone criterion. So any criterion where I can, if it's true for a long part, it's also true for a shorter part, it is decreasing monotone. And the speed criterion we looked at and the direction criterion we looked at, both of those are decreasing monotone. And if we have a decreasing monotone criterion, let me first put up, so not only speed and heading, so one more criterion, and that will be useful for the geese, is a disk criterion. So if you think of saying all the points should be in a disk of radius 30 kilometers, then also then if I make my trajectory, my sub-trajectory shorter, this property will still be true. And also if I start combining these criterion, so if I say the speed should be somehow bounded and it should stay in a disk, or the other examples that we already saw, direction and speed should be bounded together. Also, these combinations always have the property that if it's true on a long one, it will be true on a shorter one. So conjunctions and disjunctions of these decreasing monotone criteria are again decreasing monotone. Now, if we have this type of criterion, then algorithmically it's actually they are very easy to handle, and we can actually do what I already did by these examples where I always started at the beginning, because if it's decreasing monotone, then a simple greedy strategy works. So that means what I can do, I can simply start at the beginning, test whether the criterion is valid. If so, I will continue, and then maybe at some point it breaks. But now, since it's decreasing monotone, I know that if it's not valid on this part, it can also not be valid on any longer part. So there's no reason to check anything beyond it. So at this point I could cut and restart. And if we think of the criterion that I showed, like speed or heading, then every time I add a point, I can in constant time check whether the criterion is still valid, and then this will give me a linear time algorithm by simply at every point in constant time checking is the criterion still valid or not, and if not, I'll start a new segment. So why is a greedy strategy correct? So we have a very simple, can in a very simple way check the greedy choice property here. So let's assume in a valid in the optimal segmentation I picked this one, but the test here would actually also still have been valid. So I could have added this point to this first part. Then I can obviously still add it to the first part, and then the segmentation beyond that will still be valid, because if I make something shorter, it remains valid. So in that way, there's no reason to stop early, and the greedy strategy indeed works. Now there's some criterion where this simply going step by step is too slow, namely those where I cannot in constant time check whether the criterion is still valid. So if you think of the staying within a certain radius criterion, what we're essentially checking is we're doing minimum enclosing ball, solving the minimum enclosing ball problem. So there it's not that easy to solve that problem dynamically. So that means if I add another point, I might need to recompute my whole ball. So then it is better to use this double and search strategy, which we already saw for the simplification. So if you remember the Agarwal et al. Algorithm, the greedy algorithm for simplification, the strategy there was to first check using exponentially increasing steps and then doing a binary search. Yeah, so here we would start testing with something short, then we would double the length, we'd again double the length, maybe here it is now not, the criterion no longer holds, but now I know here it was true, here it was not, so the longest possible stretch will be somewhere in between, and then I just do a binary search in between. So to summarize this part on decreasing monotone criterion, so we looked at Boolean or linear combinations of decreasing monotone criterion, and if an incremental strategy of testing the criterion works, then very often we get linear time algorithms, and if not, we get algorithms, typically algorithms that run in order n log n time, assuming that we still can check whether a criterion is valid in linear time. So much about decreasing monotone criteria, but let's go back to this goose example. So we have these two behaviors, stopover and migration flight, and let me just also show you a little bit more about the data set. So this is about spring migration. So we have 4 to 5 positions per day, up to 10 stopovers. And if we really look at the criterion that we have, okay, flight, as I said, can be described simply as fairly straight movement. but a stopover, so we should stay within a radius of 30 kilometers. That's a decreasing, yes? Yes?
We have to find the axis for monotony.
Okay. So let me go to my schematic drawing here. Oh, where was it? Far back here.
All of these are fixed axes.
No. This is so monotone. Monotone is just in relation to the trajectory. So there's no direction in terms of monotonicity. So it's not monotone in the geometric sense. But this is simply defined as if I have a trajectory and there's not, so it, let me simply draw one. So maybe my criterion, my question is, does it stay within a disk? So, and what I'm now saying, this is a monotone criterion in the sense that if I have some part of the trajectory, and this is now not monotone in x or y or anything. If I have a part of the trajectory where this is true, where this property holds, so it holds on this part here, then it's monotone in the sense that if I take a smaller part, let's say this part, the criterion is still true.
I mean, we need to have all the sub-trajectories are monotone with a unique axis or not?
No, there's no. So what I'm saying, the monotonicity is not in terms of the geometry. It's not in relation to an axis, but simply in the sense that. So this is just about the subset relation. It's monotone in the sense that if it's true for a large part, then it's true for every subset. So there's no geometry in this monotonicity concept. I like this. So this is not with an axis, but I'm just saying if it's true for this big part, it's true for the smaller part. Any other questions? Okay. So let's get back to these skis. So flight is just heading in directed. Here we just say it should be fairly directed. So that is a decreasing monotone criterion. The stopover, if we look at this, it should stay within a radius of 30 kilometers. So that is exactly this criterion here. So that is decreasing monotone. And it should do so for 84 hours. Because a goose to get enough rest, it needs to stay in this area for a longer time. I mean, you can think of this as typically it's kind of a nice area of lakes, and it will stay there for a longer amount of time until it feels refreshed and then move on. And staying within an area for 48 hours, that is certainly not decreasing monotone. Because it's not the fact that if I'm staying there for 48 hours and now I'm making my trajectory shorter, that this is still fulfilled. But before I move on, let me also just show you some results on what's to come now in terms of the algorithms. So in terms of an empirical study, what we looked at was, or not we, this is actually work by Michael Bokhin and others. They looked at what the biologists did in terms of segmenting the trajectories and what the algorithms did. And I mean, you see quite a bit of similar segmentation, not always. Also, here sometimes these segments are simply a bit shorter, but more or less it gives a similar segmentation. But now back to this issue of not being monotone. So we have a stopover should stay within a radius of 30 hours, but it should do so for 2 days. And this is now decreasing monotone, but this is actually the opposite. Because this has a property that if it's true for a short trajectory, so in this case a trajectory of at least 2 days, it will be also true for any longer trajectory. So two of these criteria are decreasing monotone, but one is what I would call increasing monotone. And the type of criteria we want to deal with now is combinations of increasing and decreasing monotone. And for these criteria, we can no longer use a greedy strategy. I have a small example here. If you simply say, okay, every segment should have at least 2 of my data points. No, 3, if it's duration 2, 3 data points. But the speed range should be at most 4. Then a greedy strategy would include everything up to here. And then be not able to compute a valid segmentation of the rest because everything should have duration at least 2. But instead, I can get a valid segmentation by stopping early here and then taking the rest over there. So here, a greedy strategy no longer works. So now I first want to show you kind of the generic approach of segmentation and then improve it for the specific case of decreasing and increasing monotone criteria. And this is in a paper by Aronov et al. It's called start-stop diagrams. And so that approach simply handles general criteria. And examples for criteria that are not decreasing monotone is, as we saw, minimum amount of time on that trajectory. Then if I have a bound on standard deviation or some kind of average also, I will not get a decreasing monotone criteria. Also, if I want to allow some kind of percentage of outliers, all of this is not decreasing monotone. And so instead, we will compute these start-stop diagrams and use those to then compute the segmentation. And the idea is very simple. So I've given my trajectory. I have a trajectory and I have the timestamps. And now for any possible segment, so if I'm only, and I assume I'm only segmenting at vertices, for any possible segment I can check whether it's valid. So here, for instance, I'm saying the segment from 0 to from the essentially first point to then the second, third, fourth, fifth. That is a valid segment, and that's why I color the cell white. Also to the 6th would be valid. To the 7th no longer would be valid, and that's why I'm coloring this gray. And likewise, there's no valid segment starting at the next data point. That's why all of this column is gray. So we get this white space, which is free space, you could say, we call it, and the black space or gray space, which is forbidden space. And now a segmentation. So a segmentation should start at the beginning. It should go to a vertex where the segment is valid. So it should go to a free space cell. And then at that free space cell, I start a new segment. That means I go look at the corresponding column, and from there again go to something that is reachable or in free space from there. So I would go maybe here, and so on. That means a valid segmentation is such a staircase path where all of the steps are in free space. And now an optimal segmentation is such a staircase with a minimum number of steps, with a minimum number of links. So I want to do this with as few steps as possible. So in this example, this would now correspond to, if this is maybe my trajectory, then I cut at 6, and then I cut at 9 again, 11 and 12. So then this would be my segmentation. Now this staircase we can compute by a very simple dynamic program. So let me just quickly show it. So essentially I just, for every possible, so I compute up to any vertex what is the segmentation with the smallest number of pieces. So for that I'm going to maintain the number of links that I saw so far. I'm also going to maintain what was my previous step, so that I can at the very end not only know how long my the minimum segmentation is, but from this second information I can also reconstruct what the segmentation is, and then I just fill it up from left to right. So initially I need 0 steps. If I want to go to vertex number 1, that is not possible at all, so then there's an infinite number of steps, you could say, and so on. Here is the first interesting case. This one I can reach by starting at 0. So then I'm using 1 step. This one I can also reach directly from 0, so I also get 1 step. Here now, if I want to get here, I will have to use one of these. And the ones where there's a non-infinity value is this one here. So here I was able to get with 1 step. So 1 step more gives me 2, and so on. And then at the very end, I know there's a valid segmentation using 4 segments, and this last allows me to see what the actual segmentation is. So I can follow it back to here, and then here, and 3, and 0. Yes?
This algorithm, you need to choose the orthogonal edges only, and we have at least two subtrajectories, at least, yeah. We cannot join the 0 to S directly.
Yeah, so what you first do is you compute this diagram, and in this diagram for illustration, the gray parts are parts where the segmentation is not valid. So I cannot go from 0 to immediately the last point, because this would not be a valid segmentation, because this one is gray. So I can only, if I want to make a step, I can only do it within at white area.
If we have a criteria that all the pixels are white,
then it's 1 step, yes.
Yeah, only one section,
Yeah, then it's only 1 segment, yes.
But in this algorithm, we have at least, I think, we have at least 2 sections.
No.
We have to choose only the orthogonal movement.
So if this top right one is white, then this one it will. So I mean, this is so the dynamic program simply for a given row here checks all of the white cells, looks up which number you find, and then takes that plus 1. So if this one would be white, I would see here, okay, the smallest number which I can use to get here is actually the 0. So I will take that, and then this will be a 1.
In the previous slide, we have only...
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. Okay, and this is, of course, so I do this is a linear number of values to compute, and for each value in the worst case I'm looking at the whole row. So this is a quadratic time algorithm. And now we would like to, so quadratic time for the big data is a bit slow. So now we want to do better, and we will do so by looking at a specific type or class of criteria, and I will argue that this class is actually kind of a very relevant and big class, so which allows us to solve most of the problems we're interested in, and that is what I call stable. And stable means that if I look at the number of changes on some kind of on a candidate segment ending at I, which means if you look at a row of this diagram, then the number of changes should be small, in the sense that if I look at do this row by row, then overall there's only a linear number of changes. Yeah, so here in this diagram, if to count this value, there's 1 change here, 1 change here, 1 here, 1 here, 0 changes here. So this sum would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and so that's in O of n in this case, you could say. And that type of criteria we call stable. So you could say on average it should have a constant number of changes. And if you look at specifically decreasing and increasing monotone criteria, they fulfill this property. So this is a decreasing monotone criterion. So meaning if this is white, everything below is white. But then the forbidden space has this ortho-convex shape, or the staircase shape, let's say. That means I will only have overall a linear number of changes, and the same for increasing monotone. Increasing monotone, that is that as soon as I have something white that remains white, then again this non-free space has a staircase shape like this, and it is a stable criterion. And for stable criteria, you can encode these diagrams more efficiently, so we can use a run length encoding. So now I'm going to store this row not as a row as such, but I'm storing the number of non-free cells, and then the number of free cells, and so on. So here I only have free cells. So this gives me, for a stable criterion, a representation of this diagram of linear size. Now, if we want to use this efficiently, the first step that we need to be able to do efficiently is to compute this diagram efficiently. And this we would like to do in the following way. So I want to essentially know where these steps are. So this is now for a decreasing monotone criterion, not general stable, but decreasing monotone criterion. What I can simply do is I have 2 pointers. So let's say I start at the end. I see how far back I can go while still being valid. So let me do that. This is still valid. This is still valid. This is no longer valid. And as soon as I see that it's no longer valid, I know, because it's decreasing monotone, I don't have to check anything here. I also know that in the next row I can go at least as far. So now I can simply move this pointer. No, it should move, good. And continue from here. So now I will move this pointer again until it's no longer valid, and in this way find all of the staircase. What we need to have, if we want to run this algorithm, we need to be able to move this pointer, which means we need to be able to extend a segment. We need to be able to move this pointer, so we need to be able to shorten a segment. And then we need to be able to check whether a segment is valid. So what we need is some kind of data structure which allows the following 3 operations: testing is valid, allowing to extend, and allowing to shorten. And typically the data structure used here will be a balanced binary search tree. In particular, if we have, for instance, for a criterion like a bounded range. So if I am asking about, let's say, speed in the speed should be in a certain range, then that information I can store the speed values in a balanced binary search tree, and then the extend and shorten is simply insertion deletion, and is valid I can also check easily. So I need those 3 operations, but those are typically also easy enough to get. And then the running time is n times the time these operations take. So this will typically be n log n. And we can do the same approach also works for increasing monotone criteria. So this means that we can compute the start-stop diagrams for increasing and decreasing monotone criteria efficiently. And now if we have any combinations of those, then we first compute the basic ones for the increasing or decreasing monotone criteria, and then start combining them. So for instance, if this is an increasing monotone criteria, if I want to combine it with a decreasing monotone criteria, then that is a fairly simple operation to do, which I can still do in linear time. Also, if I need to negate a criterion, that I can also do in linear time, then I just have to change essentially those colors, you could say, what's free and what's forbidden. So all of these operations now simply take a linear time. So let's see what we can handle by now. So let me give you a few examples, which not all of them we were able to handle previously. So we can give lower and upper bounds on attributes. So that is actually that was an example for a decreasing monotone one. angular range criterion was also decreasing monotone, this criterion also decreasing monotone, but we now can also do something like allow an approximate fraction of outliers. So if you think of this, it is not directly obvious that it's decreasing or increasing monotone, but since I allow myself some kind of approximation, I can phrase it in terms of if the trajectory has a certain length, which as such is an increasing monotone criterion. If it has a certain length, then the number of outliers should be below a certain value, which is a decreasing monotone criterion. And then I can combine several of these. So in this case, I actually, if I want to do an approximation, I would combine a logarithmic number of these and can express in this way a fraction of outliers, at least in terms of a true approximation or whatever approximation factor we then would like to have. So this is how we previously computed a segmentation. So with this table here, and now the question is, how can we do faster? And the idea is to use range searching and to augment binary search trees. So let me just briefly, so this is just one slide about augmenting binary search trees, which you all know. So we first choose an underlying data structure, maybe it's a red-black tree. Then we determine the additional information that we want to maintain, which is, in our case, the minimum number of steps needed in the subtree for the end start points that are in the subtree. Then we verify that this can be maintained, but such a minimum count, I only have to look at the node itself and its children, so that is easy to do. And then we have to use this in our algorithm. And what we essentially do use this for is range searching. So let me show this by one example. So assume we now want to again compute, we essentially do the same dynamic program as before. So we compute how far we get for row by row. Now assume we are in this row here and want to compute how far we can get. So now here I see this 5. So it means that I have a block of 5 free cells. If I have the row indices, a binary search tree on the row indices, and I've augmented this tree with the minimum number of links needed for any subtree, then I can simply do a range search on this block to find the minimum number of links needed for any of these rows, and in this way compute this value in log n time. So this will overall then give me, for this part of the algorithm, a running time of order n log n. Okay, so to sum up the criteria-based segmentation, I showed you a greedy algorithm. I showed you this example of goose migration. The start-stop diagrams as such give you quadratic time, but for a large set of criteria, and I would argue many criteria fall under this condition, we can actually have algorithms that run in order n log n time. So now I have a second part based on model-based segmentation. I'm not sure how early did I start. When did I start?
So, I think it took 45 minutes. So if you want more or not.
No, I don't. I mean,
It was 5 after 9.
I have 20 minutes. Yes, good. Yeah, that was my question. Thank you. So I would like to show you this model-based segmentation. In particular, it will be a dynamic program, so that I will do somewhat fast, because we've seen enough dynamic programming today, at least for my lecture. If you have dynamic programming, everyone will be happy to see it. But I want to show you how we classify segments, because that's also geometrically an interesting problem. So now the setting, here's a data set where we looked at this for. So this is a fisher. It's a small mammal. We would like to segment the trajectory of this fisher, but we don't have any given criteria. So we don't know, or we don't make any assumptions about what behavior we are looking for, which is a very common setting. If somebody has a data set like this and wants to understand what is a behavior, then it's maybe not the very often we cannot simply ask back, yeah, but what behavior, would you characterize that behavior? But they want to know themselves how that behavior looks like. So in such a setting, you cannot use criteria-based segmentation if you don't know what the criteria should be. And that is a setting where we now want to still do a meaningful segmentation. So we call that so this was the model that we essentially always use if we talk about trajectories. So we have the data points, and we just assume linear motion in between. Now, think of a setting where we have fewer data points. So all of these data points are missing. Okay. We can still do straight line segments between the data points that we have, but the fewer data we record, the more unrealistic this assumption of linear motion will be. So then, at least biologists like to fit statistical or stochastic models to the data. One that is actually used quite frequently is a model of Brownian motion or Brownian bridges. So here you see a Brownian motion. And a Brownian bridge is essentially a Brownian motion conditioned under the knowledge that one data point was here and one data point was here and so on. So a bridge essentially fills the gap in between two data points. So the assumption here is that also the data points, assuming that I have some GPS error, I don't exactly know where the object is. So I have a normal a Gaussian distribution here, a Gaussian distribution here, and then while interpolating over time, I'm assuming I have a Brownian motion, and then the movement that I get in between at any point in time again will be a Gaussian distribution with a variance which increases if you're further away from any data point.
So you mean that it is somehow a limit cycle of the dynamical system?
Say that again.
So you mean that this is somehow a limit cycle of the continuous dynamical system, which could be somehow arise from this discrete one? Is that a limit cycle?
The limit cycle?
Yeah, these trajectories around these points. Is that a limit cycle is something like which in the asymptotic of the dynamical system there are some sort of the behaviors which somehow generically appears, and everything is somehow tends to that situation. So I was wondering if you're looking at these kind of this kind of positions in terms of asymptotic of a dynamical system or something like that.
Okay, so I don't know asymptotical dynamical systems that well, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure. The setting here is actually very simple. I know where I was here. I know where I was. No, I know that I was more or less here. I know that I was more or less here. So then I will if this in between in terms of so let me do time axis here. So I know at this time where I was. I know at this time where I was. Now I look at any time in between. I'm interested in the distribution of where I might have been. So that is then. And essentially the question, where would a Brownian motion be conditioned on the fact that I know that here I was here and there I was there. So it's a very simple model, and I think you will know better how that fits into the larger scope of your question. Good. And this now allows us also to look at problems like this. So let's assume this is my very sparse trajectory. I want to know whether this area was visited. So in gray, you may or may not see. In gray, this is supposedly the actual trajectory, maybe. So it actually moved through A. The polygonal path that I get did not move through A. But if I assume such a model, then I would at least say, okay, with a certain probability, I moved to A, or the expected time I spent in A is something also. So this allows me to make inferences about the trajectory if I don't if the data is sparse. And this model of Brownian motion has one parameter, the diffusion coefficient. So I'm fitting a model with one parameter, and depending on how I set the parameter, I get different movements. So this is just one instance for if the diffusion coefficient is very low, so it's fairly, I'm fairly straight, it's mathematically certainly wrong, but it stays fairly close to the straight path. If I increase the diffusion coefficient, I will get more diffusion, and eventually I get a lot of variation in the path. So now the idea is to say I want to fit such a Brownian bridge motion model to my data using a certain parameter, and then for different subtrajectories I might want to fit a different parameter, because maybe certain parts are very straight, then I want to use a low parameter. On certain parts maybe the trajectory moves a lot around while not making large distance, then I want to fit a larger diffusion coefficient. So the question is segmenting such that I can fit a diffusion coefficient well. So what I want to do is I want to, for each subtrajectory, if I look at any subtrajectory, I have a likelihood function which tells me for a given parameter, and I would like to maximize this likelihood for every segment. Now the problem is if I just say, okay, I want to maximize the likelihood, then my trajectory will be cut in many small pieces, because the smaller the pieces, the easier it is to fit the parameter, or the better I can fit the parameter. So here now we have a trade-off between how well the fit is and how many segments I get. And that is a setting where often an information criterion is used. So what I will do is, for my segmentation, I'm going to look at how well the fit is. So I'm going to look at the likelihood, or actually the log likelihood. But I will also have, to avoid overfitting, I will also have a parameter, a penalty factor for the number of segments. And depending on how large this penalty factor is, I might get fewer segments or more segments. So this part is to avoid overfitting, and it kind of nicely gives us a setting that we don't hopefully get a small number of segments. And now an optimal segmentation is a segmentation that minimizes this term. And okay, as I said, we've already seen a few dynamic programming algorithms. This again is a simple dynamic programming algorithm where either it's essentially the n squared algorithm that we already saw, where I have an additional term which relates to computing computing the optimal parameter for a certain subtrajectory, or if I already know which diffusion, I have a kind of a discrete set of diffusion coefficients as candidate sets, so I know I want to fit to a subset of these diffusion coefficients, then I can essentially have a dynamic programming table where I have a row for each candidate, and then I get an order n times m algorithm. But instead of going into detail about this algorithm, I'd like to move on to the classification or clustering problem. So here's just, but let me show an example of a result for this. So what I have here, what I'm showing here is the number of segments versus the penalty factor. So the penalty factor, for the penalty factor, the larger the penalty factor, the more costly it is to use many segments. So if I have a large penalty, I would use very few segments. So at the end, I will only use one segment. On the other hand, if I have a very low penalty factor, I will have many segments. And we, in kind of an interactive setting, we use this to look at if I plot penalty factor versus number of segments, then we are essentially looking for, you could in this diagram, we're looking for a stable part, you could say, so kind of a penalty factor which holds for a wide, the number of segments which holds for a large range of penalty factors, and then chose that as a segmentation that we used. And this one is then shown here on the right. But the question that I'd now still want to address is the following: if I have a segmentation like this, how can I cluster or classify the segments into a small number of classes? So now we have the segments, but every segment will have its own diffusion coefficient. But if I assume that this comes from a process where there is essentially a small number of behaviors, and if I assume that with each of these behaviors I can associate a certain diffusion coefficient, then I'm actually looking for a small number of diffusion coefficients which I can use on such that I can use for each of these segments one of these diffusion coefficients. So you can imagine in terms of behaviors, you might have a behavior where somebody is resting. So then actually you have or resting or just moving in a very confined area. So then you have a lot of data points which are on one spot and just kind of moving around there. Then you might have settings where somebody actually wants to travel somewhere, like here on the screen. So then there you expect a very low diffusion coefficient. Maybe if an animal is foraging, it stays in an area but really moves around a lot in that area, then you would expect a high diffusion coefficient and so on. But you'd like to use one diffusion coefficient for foraging, one diffusion coefficient for kind of directed travel, and so on. So now this problem actually looks very similar to the previous one, with a couple of small changes. Now we want to not maximize the likelihood of a segmentation, but a likelihood of the classification. Or let me say this classification in terms of, so classification is a terminology that biologists like to use here. In terms of data analysis tasks, this is more clustering. So we want to maximize the likelihood of a classification, again using log likelihoods and a penalty factor, but now this is not the number of segments, but the number of different classes that we are using. And then an optimal classification is a classification that minimizes the number of, minimizes this criteria, this information criteria. And the results here are, if we have only a discrete number of parameter values that we allow to use, so essentially if we say instead of having a continuous range of values, we're going to sample the space, so then I get this discrete number of values that I might want to fit to. Then we get a polynomial time algorithm. The general problem is NP-hard, but I'm not going to show you the proof here today. But if we, under reasonable assumptions, under how the log likelihoods look like, we can actually get again a polynomial time algorithm. And this is what I'd like to focus on in the last 5 minutes. So this is a setting. Now it's actually by now very ungeometric, you could say, but it will get geometric again, because now my input, I don't really need the trajectories, I need the likelihood functions. My input is a set of likelihood functions, and the output should be a partition of these trajectories according to the likelihood functions, and for each group a parameter value x, such that this information criterion is minimized. It's maybe the first important observation is that it is not the fact that if I just look at the maximum values of these likelihoods, that an optimal classification respects the order of maxima. So this is an example where the first likelihood function has its maximum here, the second one here, the third one there, the fourth one here. But if I want to use two values, then it's best to place one value here, the other one there. But then actually L2 will be classified together with L4 and L3 together with L1. So there's no monotonicity that we can use immediately. But there is a slightly different property that still rescues the situation for us. And that is, if I have a set of values, so I have this x1 and that x2, and I have a likelihood function with one maximum, then it will be, so the class this L2 falls into will be either the one just smaller or the one just larger. So for each of these likelihoods, I essentially need to, if I know the parameters, I have to decide between two of them. So if I have a discrete set of candidate values, then again I get a simple dynamic programming approach where I compute the optimal classification for the first, using the first I values. So let me do that by example. If I only use this parameter, allow this parameter, then since L1 has a maximum to the left of it, and this is the first one, certainly L1 would fall into the class of x1. And for these we don't know yet. If I have x1 and x2, then L1 will certainly fall into here. L2 and L3 have their maximum between x1 and x2. So at this point, if I know I want to include x2, I can decide for 2 and 3 whether they should go here or here, and they will go there. If I also allow x3, then I see that that it's actually, so then I will look at the two optima here, add x3 as optional additional value. So here, either I will take x1 and x3, or I take x1, x2 and x3. For both I test where to place all of them. So in particular, if x2 is missing, then L2 and L3 have to decide between x1 and x3. And that is actually because of, in this case, the information criterion, the better fit. So the optimal classification using x3 is actually using x1, only x1 and x3, and mapping the 1 and 3 here and 2 there. And I can continue like that and get an algorithm that runs in, if I have k likelihood function, then k m squared time. So one more observation here is that if we add possible parameters values one by one, then actually the in terms of how much these functions shift, that is bounded, and we're going to use that in the following. This is again, you could see it as a dynamic program, although we will formulate a slightly different approach for the problem if we do not have a discrete set of parameter values. So, and the idea here is, I will be looking at a diagram. So now my dynamic program will be on the number of, I will extend the number of classes always one by one. And in that way, I'll be looking at settings where I will be looking at a setting where, let me the index now I don't have on the previous slide, where given that I know where with fewer classes I place the parameter, I might now kind of, the corresponding trajectories might shift to other parameter values, but I can express this in terms of in terms of what am I saying? Oh, yeah, here. So here it is. So what I want to, so I have a classification with I parameter values. I now want to compute the classification with I plus 1 parameter values. I know that if I look at the j's value, so in sorted order, the j's parameter and the j plus first parameter, it has to live in the space of the j minus, so the j's parameter needs to be between the j minus 1's parameter from the previous classification and the j's parameter of the new one. Yeah, so if I allow myself one more parameter values, they kind of might shift a little bit, and the new j's one will be in between here, and the j plus first one will be in between these two values, and I can geometrically look at this like this. And then if I not only look at not only want to find the j's and the j plus first one, but the j minus 1 and j's one, then I again get some kind of staircase as we had in the start-stop diagram. And the important, and let me use this more or less to wrap up, the important observation here is that if I look at the following, you could say isoline, which is which describes that so I have this likelihood function of this likelihood function L1, and I'm looking, I now assume that it has this nice, that it just has one maximum. And this is then, I look at the two values where the likelihood function is the same. And so this P has the same value as Q. And I plot this value in this space. And I do this for every possible height here. Then I get this curve. And what this curve describes is, if I now think about where to, if I now in the space say, okay, this point where, which describes in the I plus first classification the j's and the j plus first value, if I know that this point is here, then I know that what does it mean? It means that the j's one is so it means that in terms of L1, the trajectory that corresponds to L1, I can read off from whether it's below or above, whether it should, in terms of the classification, go to the class J or the class J plus 1. Yeah, so if I'm exactly on that curve, meaning if this point is exactly on that curve, it means that these two values are values where the likelihood is the same. So if I'm exactly on that curve, it doesn't matter which class I use, but I can use this class to determine whether to go to class J or to go to class J plus 1. And now what I can do is I add more likelihood functions, and I look at now the space, so arrangement of lines that I get by adding all of these, you could say, isolines. And the nice property now here is that as soon as I pick a pair of values which corresponds to a point in this diagram, I exactly know which likelihood for which trajectories I'm going to, it falls into the class xj, and for which it falls into the class xj plus 1. So if I fix this point, so within one region, the classification is the same, so I can maximize per region, and then I use some kind of dynamic programming to extend this approach to more and more classes, and this is essentially a longest path calculation, or you could see it as a dynamic program. And let me just also show this slide. So this is where we now applied this to the Fisher data, and now you see if the classification that was computed, we have these long so the red segments are more or less long pieces of movement, and the blue ones always include a significant part where the Fisher is simply moving on one spot. So this classification this is actually the first one where we use the discrete classification, because we don't have to work with the arrangement, but it's a simpler dynamic program, gives us actually a nice classification. And with this, I like to wrap up. Let me just put up one open problem, and that is so stable criteria, which is a large class of criteria, so we can handle increasing and decreasing. We have efficient algorithms, but in general we don't. And there's still some kind of class in between where it would be nice to have efficient algorithms because it's an important class, but I don't know how to handle them. And that are essentially settings where you have an average or standard deviation, because these are non-monotone. I mean, if you think of an average, I might have a segment. The average is, let's say, let's take a criterion where I say the average should be above some value. So maybe for this part the average is above this value. Then it might drop below that value. So, but then if it goes up again, then I might again get something where it's above that value. So averages are non-monotone. Similarly, standard deviation is non-monotone. But it is a criterion that is often used. So it would be nice to get faster algorithms for this problem. And that's it. Thank you.
If somebody has a question, maybe one or two.
I have 2 questions.
Another one.
What is the definition of half-life and
So the outlier here is always relative to the criterion. So if I, for instance, have this criterion where I say speed difference is bounded by delta, let's say, that is my criterion, then I'm just saying that outlier just means that I'm allowed for a subtrajectory, so maybe I have this nice subtrajectory but some kind of weird outlier here. So all of this has similar speed, and then I could, as a criterion, instead of just taking this, if I want to be robust to outliers, I would say speed difference is bounded by delta except for, and then I can say maybe a number of outliers, or the example that I gave was where I say, okay, except for 10% of the points. So that's what I mean here by outlier. So it's not necessarily geometry.
my second question is that do you simplify the trajectories and then want to compute the main one by maximum likelihood or something like that, or you want to add points that you never had by computing that maximum likelihood?
So, I mean, I introduced these models these models are very often used for sparse data, and that is how I introduced them. But for the segmentation or classification problem as such, we don't throw away data points. So we don't do simplification. But for the model fitting, I think for the Brownian bridge motion model, the standard model fitting is that this leave one out approach, where you essentially say, so you have your data points, and then you look at, you now estimate the parameter by saying, okay, let's assume these I simply assume are given, and I want to compute a parameter such that the likelihood is maximized that this one would be here, here, and here. But yeah, so this is more about computing the parameter. And also you can use different approaches there, but that is what we use.
What kind of simplification preserves the probability distribution? Because if we are simplifying like by pressure distance, even if the input points are from a normal distribution, it doesn't mean that our simplification corresponds to that distribution or even not.
So that's an interesting question, but in this context, it's not a question that we. So I mean, we weren't simplifying here. I have some work on simplification under could say uncertainty assumptions, but that's in, yeah, not so related to segmentation.
Okay. If you want to have any other question, you can continue in the break time. This break time after 30 minutes, we come back for our next lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.